My name is Sharon Welsh. When I started studying the book with Mary Wynne, Sheila, and the others, I knew very little about the United Nations and had only a surface understanding of the Baha'i writings on peace and global governance. Although I have learned lots, I know I still have just a very basic understanding of global governance and Baha'i teachings on these. But what has been significant for me is my awareness of how much the world needs a reformed and a strong UN, and how much the teachings of Baha'u'llah has and can continue to contribute to this conversation. Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, Shoghi Effendi, and the House of Justice have all dedicated tablets, letters, books, and messages to the topic of peace. The need for a global government with high ideals, clear laws, and the power to enforce are found throughout the Baha'i writings. So I want to start by looking at a quote from Abdu'l-Baha's first tablet to The Hague, because I think you will see the recommendations found in this quote reflect the proposals I will be sharing from the book. It is a long tablet, so I've tried to just pull out some of the relevant content. The full quote is available in your handouts. Abdu'l-Baha stated that members of the Supreme Tribunal should be the choicest people of each nation. They should be well informed concerning international laws and the relations between governments, as well as aware of the essential needs of the world of humanity, and that the number of representatives should be in proportion to the number of inhabitants of that country. The members should be elected by their citizens and their government. From among these people, the Supreme Tribunal will be elected. When the Supreme Tribunal gives a ruling on any international question, it is binding. And if any government or nations does not obey a decision of the Supreme Tribunal, the rest of the nations will rise up against it. I think you will be able to see these concepts reflected in the proposed changes to the United Nations we are going to explore today. Earlier, Mary Wynne showed you this diagram of the original proposal for the United Nations, where the General Assembly is the center of power and the Security Council is under its purview. The plan was for weighted national participation based on a nation's population and GDP, majority vote, so no veto, universal jurisdiction, the right to make laws that would apply to all member states, and a world court with the ability to enforce its rulings. Unfortunately, this was not what came into being. As this slide shows, what we got is quite different. These changes have had enormous consequences, as they have weakened the United Nations and its ability to serve the common good. In the current situation, the Security Council has all the power and authority. When you combine this with all 5 permanent members, that's China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, having the right of veto, you have a system that has really hampered the UN's ability to address often critical and life-threatening situations. The result of this has been more than 200 armed conflicts, with tens of millions of people having lost their lives. What is becoming increasingly clear is that reform is needed if the UN is going to be able to adequately serve the critical issues that humanity now faces. The good news is that we have the opportunity to change the United Nations using possibilities provided in the Charter. In the book, the authors prefer the option of reforming and strengthening the United Nations, but also recognize the option of replacing the UN with another structure. So let's start looking at the reform to the Security Council. The authors of the book write, perhaps the greatest weakness in the present UN Charter is the Security Council as currently configured, and in particular, the right of veto. The Security Council's right of veto is seen as a fatal flaw in the structure of the UN. The rivalries between those with veto power have frequently paralyzed the Security Councils. Countries have used the veto in their best interest to destabilize others or to avoid criticism or accountability. It is important to note that the UN and the work of the United Nations involves encouraging and supporting democratic principles and working for the best interests of humanity. And giving 5 countries the right of veto is not consistent with these principles. This privileged status for a few has eroded the legitimacy and weakened our trust in the United Nations. As the Security Council's main role involves the maintenance of peace and security, the veto has allowed too many conflicts to flourish and undermine the international rule of law. In A Governance Befitting, the Baha'i International Community wrote that reforming the overall infrastructure for promoting and sustaining peace, including reform of the Security Council itself, would enable familiar patterns of paralysis and deadlock to give way to a more decisive response to the threat of conflict. The authors recommend the Security Council be replaced with an Executive Council comprised of 24 members, that the Security Council operates under the jurisdiction of the General Assembly with a larger focus on general management of UN operations. The permanent member status would also be eliminated and members chosen using the same formula of representation as the General Assembly, which is based on population, GDP, and a common share for all countries. And most obviously, they recommend replacing the veto with a 2/3 majority vote. It's probably important to note that there have been numerous attempts to reform the Security Council or remove the right of veto, but any amendment or alterations to the Charter requires ratification by all the permanent 5 members, ensuring that they can block the removal of their right of veto as well as block reforms to the UN Charter. This resistance to change by permanent members of the Security Council may continue to be a stumbling block. If this is the case, the authors put forward several possible legal routes within the existing charter, but also recognize that if all else fails, a successor organization may be necessary, and they discuss how this might unfold. In addition to the challenges with the Security Council, there are also a number of challenges within the General Assembly. Currently, the General Assembly has no authority. They can only make recommendations. And as Mary Wynne has already said, it is truly amazing what they have accomplished with only the ability to propose, suggest, and encourage. The General Assembly also has a one country, one vote system, which is seen as unfair and undemocratic. Right now, Liechtenstein, with a population of around 38,000, has the same vote as China with over 1 billion people. Members of the General Assembly are diplomats representing their country and not citizens representing the we the people referred to in the Charter. The authors recommend that the one country, one vote system changes to weighted voting that uses the mathematical average of 3 factors: population, gross domestic product, and a membership share that is the same for all countries, 193rd%. This change to weighting voting will give the Assembly a voice that more fairly represents the relative size of its members. This would also give a greater measure of credibility, which has been lacking under the one country, one vote system. As well, expanding the powers of the General Assembly into more of a world legislature will never happen unless countries feel that there is a correspondence between the size of the country and its voting power. I am sure that you can see very clearly Abdu'l-Baha's comment, and that the number of representatives should be in proportion to the number of inhabitants of that country reflected in this recommendation. The second recommendation, lack of authority, is addressed with greater powers to legislate. The authors envision the General Assembly as the main seat of power in the reformed UN, with binding legislation and the ability to enforce. The authors state that for global governance to work, these 2 pieces need to be in place. The need for binding legislative power is also consistent with many of the Baha'i writings. For example, in the Tablet of the Hague, Abdu'l-Baha states, When the Supreme Tribunal gives a ruling on any international question, there will no longer be any pretext for the plaintiff or ground of objection for the defendant, in case any of the governments or nations in the execution of the irrefutable decision of the Supreme Tribunal be negligent or dilatory, the rest of the nations will rise up against it. The third recommendation is that membership of the General Assembly be changed from diplomats to citizens. This is a recommendation that can be started right away. Many of the other recommendations are more challenging, but it is believed that the shift to greater citizen involvement could happen fairly quickly, and that this might also help to mobilize the other needed reforms and changes. And again, this recommendation is consistent with the teachings. Select the choices of each nation who are well informed concerning international laws and the relations between government, and aware of the essential needs of the world of humanity, and not just the needs of their country. The authors present two possible options for greater citizen involvement. The first is a gradual introduction of full popular vote of citizens, starting with a small number of countries doing this, and then gradually adding others. But they suggest that the timeline for doing this is too long and the situation too urgent. The second option is to establish an interim United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. This would allow for a much quicker movement towards a goal of citizen involvement. The UN Parliamentary Assembly would be an advisory body to act as a voice of citizens, to advise on world problems, and act as a catalyst for reform. They would focus on humanity's better interest versus narrow national considerations. In time, this assembly could be granted greater powers. And the best news is, creating the UN Parliamentary Assembly can be done within the Charter as it exists. It does not require the agreement of the Security Council. To move the goal of the UNPA ahead, the authors identify several key steps. They suggest holding consultations with many of the stakeholders to build understanding and support for the concept. They also identify that they will not be starting from zero, as there is already significant support for the UNPA from many groups, including the EU and Canada. For example, here is what the EU stated. The establishment of the United Nations Parliamentary Assembly within the UN system would increase the democratic profile and internal democratic process of the organization and allow world civil society to be directly associated in the decision-making process. The final key area of reform that I want to discuss today is the role of peacekeeping. The idea for an international peace force is not new. Over 100 years ago, in the period leading up to the adoption of the League of Nations Covenant, the creation of an international military force was discussed. At the formation of the UN in 1945, there were plans to have members of the UN make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, facilities, and other supports to ensure the maintenance of international peace and security. These plans were not completed at the San Francisco Conference in 1945, and it was to be the responsibility of the Security Council to lead and facilitate the negotiations of these agreements as soon as possible. Unfortunately, this did not happen, which left one of the most important innovations of the UN Charter unrealized. Many people are now recognizing the critical need for an international peace force. The proposal is for all countries to yield sovereignty to a single international peace force, and that national militaries will be limited to only what is needed internally. They are recommending a standing force of 800,000 trained troops, projected to cost $150 billion, which is actually pretty small considering that current world military spending is $2 trillion. The recommendations presented here are just some of the key recommendations put forward in the book. It is evident to many people the world over that the UN is in need of reform if it is going to be able to address the needs of humanity going forward. The emergence of organizations such as the Coalition for the UN We Need and the popularity of the book Global Governance and the emergence of global institutions for the 21st century show the increasing awareness that we are faced with global threats that require greater international cooperation. The Baha'i international community spoke of these needs in a government's befitting, and I would like to end with a quote from this. The range of areas in which the established systems and approaches are in need of radical transformation suggests how critical the coming quarter of a century will be in determining the fortunes of humanity. Thank you.